preconceived notions on this, because there are not easy answers here. We're going to have to consider an awful lot of perspectives if we're going to find a way to continue making the city as livable as it's been. Our next speaker is Greg Richmond. Greg Richmond has worked for the Triage Emergency Care Services since 1993, beginning as a direct service worker in Triage's emergency shelter in Vancouver's downtown east side. In 1998, he joins Triage's management team, first as the manager of the shelter, and then as the manager of Triage's housing department. Greg specializes in developing programs for repeatedly
two projects in Vancouver over the last 15 years. Just a little introduction to Triage. Triage is a non-profit. We operate 9 developments in Vancouver, and we have 2 more in process of being developed. We do work with a particular part of the homeless population, those living with a mental illness and substance use issues. In terms of the NIMBY piece, what I want to talk about is the impact of NIMBY on proposed housing sites and how that impacts policy and how it impacts the actual process of developing a housing project and getting it built. Our experience, like I said, was with two projects. The first one was in 1992, and that was concerning the location of our shelter at 707 Powell Street. That was an extremely escalated community process that was very divisive. The residents of Strathcona were involved, the BIA was involved, and as a result of that process, the NIMBY process actually impacted the site selection, and a different site was chosen for the shelter. This, of course, delayed a number of things, the building of the shelter and the housing. It escalates costs. And it takes a whole lot of time and energy from everyone from city staff to development teams. Our more recent experience with NIMBY is on our Fraser Street project, and that really was in about 2005, 2006. I don't know if you remember seeing it on the news. It was very high profile. It was in all the major media. It was talked about in the legislature. We had politicians, both municipal and provincial and federal, lining up on various sides and in various ways. What came out of that particular process was a significant delay in construction, which added to the construction costs, probably well into 6 figures. It actually was the impetus for the citywide supported housing process. It's just wrapped up recently. So the city now has, the city and Vancouver Coastal Health collaborated on the generation of a citywide supported housing strategy, and part of that is what we're seeing now with the recent announcement of the BC housing units. So yeah, with the recent announcement, that builds on the supported housing strategy in terms of identifying sites and trying to get through a community consultation process in as expedient and inclusive manner as possible. So when we look at NIMBY, certainly it's impacted both of our projects. And if you look at some of the other social services developments that have been in place over the last number of years and gone to council, NIMBY has actually changed sites. It's influenced the development permit process to such an extent that conditions can get put on developmental permits, such that the nonprofit will pull out of the site because the conditions are too onerous to operate. So my question to everybody here today is, what can we do as a community in all our different roles to reduce the impact that NIMBY has on policy and on the development process? So when municipal and provincial funding bodies are looking at developing housing and they're creating policy around it, how do we actually deal with that and influence that process such that NIMBY doesn't dictate where housing goes, the kind of housing it is, and that sort of just thing?
What's NIMBY?
Good question.
Yeah.
So NIMBY is an acronym. It's for Not in My Backyard. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about NIMBY is and this happens in most communities that I've heard of. And what that is there's a significant local opposition to the use of the land for a particular project. So that can be anything from airports to prisons to transit. In our case, in Vancouver, there has historically been significant local opposition to everything from mental health group homes to housing that's higher density than the neighbors want. So the communities are getting more and more organized around the NIMBY piece, and we've seen, as a result of our Fraser Street, the opposition in the neighborhood there. There's actually a group in Vancouver formed now that's called Not in Anyone's Backyard. And what they're trying to do is say that people with disabilities and addictions and mental illnesses need not to be in the community. So you can actually Google that acronym, Not in Anyone's Backyard, and you can get the site. And there's some pretty interesting stuff in there. So one of the things I want to say about what we can do as a community in our roles, just to kind of give you an example of how we could broaden that out. And that would be from an operator perspective. One of the things that came up in our Fraser Street process was people citing examples of addictions recovery houses in Vancouver that were poorly operated, that people were using, they were doing crime in the local area, and they cited as an example of enough. Our communities, we've got enough of these places and they're poorly operated and we don't want them. And in fact, that has been at times the case in Vancouver with very, very small nonprofits operating very poorly run housing operations. So that's an example of what an operator needs to do. It's also an example of what the city and Vancouver Health need to do in terms of making sure that these places are well run so that the community can't point to developments and say, this is what happens when you put social housing in place. My second sticking point would be to talk about location. And as a housing operator, I see location as a key to success. The right locations really mean integration for people with disabilities and opportunities and choice. And the wrong locations can mean ghettoization and isolation. So as a housing operator, we're looking for sites where people want to live, where there's choice, where there's opportunity, where they're not clumped together and abandoned in these low-cost SROs. So when it comes to discussion location, I've heard lots of different rationales as to why housing needs to be in one area or another area. And certainly in the Fraser Street process, we had lots of people talking about looking at a map of Vancouver and saying, look at all these developments over on the east side, one on the west side, we need to share it out. And the thing that was really uncomfortable about that was they were talking about housing for people with a mental illness as if it was like a garbage dump, and we all needed, every neighborhood need to have one. So that was an example of some of the dialogue, some of the rationale that's used that's actually quite discriminatory and prejudicial. Another argument around location is often around money. West side sites obviously are a lot more money than east side or downtown east side sites. However, if you just go where the cheapest land is, you do end up with these little ghettos and pockets of high-needs service areas that don't really give people the opportunity to live throughout Vancouver and to access opportunities and communities that aren't just about disabilities. So the second sticking point, my question for the tables would be, what are the key factors that should be used to decide the location of subsidized and supported housing? So again, what are those key factors that really should determine where do we put housing in our community? And the second part of that is, where's the voice of people that are homeless and poor in this scenario? They typically don't get a voice in the processes that determine where housing goes. An example of this would be the BC Housing City of Vancouver report that was just issued, the 12 sites. And it's interesting, if you read through the description of the 12 sites, only one site is in a residential neighborhood, and that's the site out on Dunbar. And the interesting thing is that that is the only site that is not going to provide housing for people with addictions. So here we have a place where on the one hand it is a residential neighborhood, but it's also the only site that's not going to take people with addictions. So the question there is this good policy, not putting this kind of housing in a residential neighborhood, or is it a result of the very, very vocal Dunbar, NIMBY process that's been very vocal and very, very adamant that they want seniors housing on that site. So that is really, is that good policy or is that NIMBY at work?